President Trump has just spoken. He explained how U.S. Special Forces removed Nicolas Maduro. This has been decades after we have seen regime change by the United States. Maduro and his wife will ultimately be brought to New York to face trial. Maduro had been the leader of Venezuela since 2013. Quote from Trump: "We're going to run the country until such time we can do a safe and proper judicious transition." He also said, "We can't take a chance that someone else takes over that doesn't have the good of Venezuelans in mind." He said that the U.S. was prepared to do a second wave if it was necessary, that the U.S. is not afraid of having boots on the ground. Now, I want to tell you what he said before getting into more details from somebody who gave more information on this particular operation called Operation Absolute Resolve. First, the president said that air, land, and sea were used. This happened in the dead of night, as these operations do, that Caracas was dark. He called it dark and deadly. All of Venezuela's military capacities were rendered useless, he said. He described how the Venezuelans were, quote, waiting for us. They knew we were coming. They were in a ready position. He also said that they were completely overwhelmed and quickly incapacitated. Trump said that there were no Americans who died in the operation, also no aircraft lost. There were people who we know were injured. Aircraft also was hit. More on that in a bit. But if you'll recall, back in November, I reported on the fact that there was a special operations command vessel under commercial cover that was leaving a port in Puerto Rico and heading toward Venezuela, that it could launch 150 Delta Force or Navy SEALs, and also had a tremendous capability with special operations helicopters on board. A source telling me then, quote, "If Trump makes the call to depose him, Maduro, the plan right now is for targeted special operations missions." Now, General Dan Caine, the chairman to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he spoke after the president and he gave more information on how this operation happened. Not that we have everything, but here's what I can share. And since it just happened a few minutes ago, I'm going back and forth with my notes here. So don't mind the fact that I'm potentially making less eye contact with you. So Caine talked about how this was the culmination of months in planning and rehearsal. This was done with the help of the CIA, no surprise, as well as the NSA, as well as the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. That it was months of work trying to understand more about Maduro and his patterns of life, where he lived, where he traveled, what he wore, what he ate, even, Caine said, his pets. Another aspect of this had to do with choosing the right day. That also includes the weather to make sure that the aircraft are able to conduct this operation. These elements certainly play a role. Caine also said that this was about trying to minimize civilian harm as well as make the enemy surprised. Well, he also described how over Christmas, there were people who were monitoring all of the conditions necessary for the operation, waiting for certain triggers, and then they knew when they had the right day to conduct this operation. So when the weather broke, there was a path that cleared. Trump last night at 10:46 p.m. gave the order, quote, "Good luck and Godspeed." The aircraft ended up flying 100 feet above the water. And that's when the U.S. started dismantling and disabling Venezuela's anti-aircraft systems. Now, they arrived at Maduro's compound, which Trump described as a fortress, a heavily defended fortress. They arrived at that compound at 1:01 a.m. They left at 3:29 a.m. So that's about 2.5 hours that these special forces were there. Starts out with ground forces isolating the area to try to be as safe as possible. Helicopters obviously came under fire. Again, I mentioned it in the beginning. One helicopter was hit, but it remained flyable during the entire mission and it didn't get left behind. It still remains in U.S. custody. At the same time, air and ground intelligence teams were providing updates in real time to the ground forces so that they would know how to navigate. And Trump, who came back a few minutes after Caine spoke, added a detail that Maduro, who was taken by surprise here, tried to hide, that he reached this heavy, heavy door, very thick door, and he had tried to open it, but he wasn't able to close it in time. Maduro and his wife ended up giving up. The Department of Justice was also there. So they ended up leaving with DOJ as well as military forces. They boarded an assault ship, the USS Iwo Jima, and they are ultimately headed to New York to face trial. There's also a photo circulating online right now of Maduro in his pajamas. I don't know if it's real or not. According to the New York Times, Maduro had, quote, tightened his inner circle and taken to changing beds in an attempt to protect himself from a potential targeted strike. Clearly, that didn't work out so well. So then Julia Barnes of the New York Times reports that the CIA had recruited a source who helped them. And they also monitored his movements with stealth drones, a fleet of these drones. Of course, all of these pieces coming together for this operation. And of course, the United States had offered a bounty of $50 million on Maduro under these narco trafficking and narco terrorism charges. Now, it's important to remember that just a few days ago, Maduro seemed to be caving into some of the pressure. He said that he wanted to negotiate, discuss drug trafficking with Trump. J.D. Vance today said that Maduro was given multiple opportunities for an exit ramp. Now, the real question is, who leads Venezuela next? Is this a country that the United States will wish, a la Iraq, that it was no longer involved in? How many resources does it drain from the United States? Let's not even talk about the legalities of this. I also don't have time right now to talk about the U.S. hostages and where that goes in this conversation. Obviously, all of this comes after the United States has been increasing pressure on Venezuela, the buildup of forces in the region, the strikes on the alleged drug boats, the seizure of the two oil tankers. It's just been pressure after pressure. Now, former CIA acting director Michael Morell spoke a few days ago about Venezuela. He said, quote, "We're not very good at planning for success. We're not very good at understanding the downsides of success." Something to think about. Now, Trump said that there is a group that will be working to run Venezuela. A journalist said, well, who will that be? And Trump said that it would be some of the people in the room. So who was he in the room with? Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, as well as CIA Director John Radcliffe, in addition to General Caine, the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman. But former senior CIA analyst Scott Hembrow, also at the same event, made a point that I found pretty notable. If Venezuela collapses, quote, "it will be very chaotic and violent." And he described her, there will be all of these different armed actors. And we're not just talking about Venezuela's security forces, which did a very bad job in protecting their leader, and would be interesting to know who CIA's asset was. Clearly someone very close to Maduro. But beyond them, there's also Colombian militants who are involved in drug trafficking. There's criminal gangs like Tren de Aragua. The United States has also gone after the Cartel de los Soles, which is the cartel of the Suns, a group that they say is involved in drug trafficking. There's dispute on whether it's a gang or a network, if it's real, if it's not, but the administration claims it's real and it's dangerous. There's also motorcycle gangs called colectivos. And of course, there's also the presence of Iran, the presence of Russia, as well as Cuba. All of these countries have had a stake in this. Now, Wes Tabor, a former drug enforcement agency a special agent who I contacted, he was the attaché to Venezuela years ago, not long ago, told me, quote, "We need to fill the gaps and make sure the regime is out totally." But one issue is that Maduro's inner circle remains, and that includes the regime enforcer Diosdado Caballo. He is still around. There has been a quote attributed to him that this was a criminal and terrorist attack. West says that he has been out in the streets, that he's not at a command center right now. But will he try to vie for power? What does the inner circle do? Trump said, "What happened to Maduro can happen to them." That is a quote. He says, "We know who they are. We're on them, and they're changing their behavior right now." There's also the question of the Nobel Peace Prize winner Maria Corina Machado, who escaped to Venezuela. If you haven't watched that interview I did with her escape planner, then you absolutely should watch that. But what happens to her? Well, West said before this press conference that she could be the interim president until there are elections. But Trump also said today that the U.S. hasn't been in contact with Machado, and it would be tough for her to be the leader because she doesn't have respect within the country. So, a lot of questions here. And West emphasizes that it's really critical to help the Venezuelan people to restoring democracy. Here's a quote from Attorney General Pam Bondi, when she announced the indictment on social media today. A quote, "Nicolas Maduro has been charged with narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, possession of machine guns and destructive devices, and conspiracy to possess machine guns and destructive devices against the United States. They will soon face the full wrath of American justice on American soil in American courts." It's also worth noting that today, January 3rd, in 1990, was the day that Panama's leader, Manuel Noriega, surrendered himself to U.S. forces. Is that a coincidence? I don't know. But something that also stood out from this conversation was what the president said here, that this serves as a warning to other countries that could threaten U.S. sovereignty. There's a question of, what is Russia thinking about this? What does China think about this? Secondary thoughts are for a country like Iran and North Korea, of course. But what do they take away from this? Of course, they're going to condemn it because they want to make the United States look bad. But secretly, maybe they would be impressed by this behavior because they are strongman, authoritarian leaders. Something that I thought was interesting to just end on right here was when Rubio got up at the podium. I don't think that he knew he was quoting the notorious B.I.G. when he said this, but he said, "If you don't know, then now you know." I'm going to leave it here. There's going to be so much more to talk about in the days ahead. But we are in uncharted waters.